Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli, and it's great to see you all here on this February night. I think you know that the center is now part of the Brooklyn Public Library. I work for the Arts and Culture Department there, as all of our programs presented here come through that department, and it's really wonderful to greet you all on behalf of all of my colleagues. So tonight, we're honored to host a conversation between historians Judith Giesberg and Stephanie McCurry about Professor Giesberg's new book, Last Seen: The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families. Here's the book. The book is inspired by the online archive, which Judy started in 2017, and you are seeing examples from that online archive here. She very kindly curated some slides that relate specifically to Brooklyn. And this archive, this website has digitized, transcribed, and now published ads that were placed in newspapers across the country by formerly enslaved people searching for family members and loved ones after emancipation. Last Seen, the book and the project, tie directly and very poignantly, I will say, to the Center for Brooklyn History's new exhibition, Traces, Family History Research and the Legacy of Slavery in Brooklyn. That exhibit is right around the corner, and I hope that if you haven't seen it, you'll visit it after the program. Our chief historian, Dominique Jean-Louis, gives public tours every Friday at 3, and there'll also be some on Saturdays. So I urge you to take a tour with her. She brings so much to the experience. So one big misconception about Brooklyn's history that we try to address in Traces is that there were no slaves in Brooklyn, in the North. That myth of a slave-free North persists to this day, and we aim to correct that narrative. In the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, Brooklyn was a slave-owning agricultural area, Flatbush especially, where 75% of families were slaveholders. The centerpiece of the Traces exhibition is the juxtaposition of two portraits. One of John A. Lott is from our collection. The second, which is commissioned, is a woman named Mildred Jones. Mildred is a direct descendant of Samuel Adams, who was enslaved here in Brooklyn by the Lott family. And so there you have these two portraits hanging side by side, a powerful statement on many, many levels. We were able to find Mildred with the help of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, known as AUGS, and the exhibit also highlights the work of Black genealogists who lead the way in searching step by step for the difficult family history of those whose descendants were enslaved. And so tonight's program and Judy's book could not be more relevant to our work here at CBH. Last Seen is available at the CBH shop, which is over there in the front of the room here. And following the program, Judy will sign copies. We are super excited to hear this conversation. And now let me tell you a little bit more about our guests. Judith Giesberg is professor of history and Robert M. Birmingham chair in the humanities at Villanova University. She's the author of several books on Civil War history, and as I mentioned, the founder and director of the Last Seen Archive. And Stephanie McCurry, who will lead the conversation, is professor of American history at Columbia University and the author of numerous books, including Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South, a finalist for the Pulitzer in history, and most recently, Women's War, Fighting and Surviving the American Civil War. Please help me welcome Judy and Stephanie to the stage.
See if we can get these mics. Hello? This one's working?
All right. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you and with Judith Giesberg to talk about her new book, Last Scene. I think everybody in this room probably knows that in the course of the American Civil War, the institution of slavery was abolished in the United States, and 4 million enslaved black people were emancipated. It took a war, the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to accomplish that. But no decree is self-enforcing. And so slavery is very hard to dismantle. It had been a foundational institution of American life for more than 200 years. And it was upheld by an absolutely massive edifice of law and custom. So that's all just to say it took a great deal to dismantle all of its parts. And I'm really not sure we have yet grappled with how difficult and for how long that went on. This whole story was, as Du Bois told us a long time ago, it was an epic human drama unmatched in modern history. So what I'm really trying to say here is that black people had to claim their freedom to make it real. And we're still writing the story of all the parts of that claiming. And the way they started was with the part that mattered most to them, which was their families, attempting to repair the unspeakable damage enslavers had inflicted on them and on generations of their families going back in time. And this is exactly where Judy and her book comes in. Her book offers one concrete and incredibly moving example of what we mean by the afterlives of slavery, the way its losses reverberated in the black family and communities into the present, deep into the 20th century, and I think black genealogists would agree, very much into the present. And so Judy's book shines a light on one crucial part of the meaning of freedom for black Americans who themselves had been held as slaves, that is to say, what she calls the freedom generation. That's what she calls them. So I thought we might start with just asking Judy to tell us about the title, Last Scene, and where it comes from, and what kinds of stories get thrown up to the light with this source.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you, Stephanie, for being here, and Marcia for inviting us, and all of you for coming this evening. And that's a perfect question to start with. The title of the book, that is also the title of the archive, and it actually comes from terms that we hear in a lot of these advertisements. You're seeing some of the advertisements projected here, and those are all from freed people who are advertising from right around here in Brooklyn, who are looking for their family members. In the ads, one of the key ways in which they hope to get somebody to help them find their family members is by describing the last time they saw their family member. So these are often very personal, always deeply moving moments that are seared in their memories of the last time they saw their mother, their child, their spouse, sibling, and they describe those moments, and 10, 20, 30 years after they were separated, they remember very vividly all the details of their separation. And they use the term last seen, right? The last time I saw them, they were here. The last time I saw her, I was being taken away. So the term for both the archive and the book comes from directly from the archive and the information included in these advertisements.
Yeah. Did the headers of the newspapers say last seen? Did they ever use that for the column, or was that just in the ads?
They're usually just in the ads. The columns that you're seeing up here, most of the advertisements will say, "Do you know them?" You probably saw one of those up here, or "Lost Friends," and then "Information Wanted" are the headlines that they mostly use. Yeah.
So as Marcia mentioned, I know this grew out of a big digital project that you've been heading at Villanova for a number of years. So I thought maybe you could tell us about that, about what the project was, who worked on it, what the methods were, what the initial goals were. You started to code at a certain point. You can learn things by coding that you can't just by reading, 1,000 ads. So could you tell us about how the project grew and how it shaped your thinking about the project and the book?
Sure. The project began the website went live in 2017. We were working on it before that. It began as a collaboration between me and an archivist at Mother Bethel AME Church, which is the mothership of the AME churches in this country, and it's in Philadelphia, where they publish the Christian Recorder, which is the official mouthpiece of the AME Church. It's still published out of Mother Bethel still today. And so the archivist, Margaret Gerardo, and I actually, probably a decade before we actually did it, started talking about whether or not we might be able to, at some point in time, begin to work on getting these ads off of the microfilm that exists at Mother Bethel of this newspaper. But before that, I first noticed these advertisements as I was reading the digitized version of newspapers at my university library. University libraries pay a lot of money to subscribe to these databases, and these advertisements seemed to me to have a lot of value, more value, I thought, to the descendants of the people named in them than they did for somebody who might encounter them casually at a university library. And so when I started to notice them, I then talked to my friend Margaret Gerardo, who's the archivist there, and we decided that what we would do is I would borrow the microfilm so that I wasn't using the databases. I was going around the databases. We would find as many of these ads as we could from this one Black newspaper and publish them on an open access database so that genealogists who are descendants of enslaved people could find them for free. We thought maybe we'd find a few hundred of them in this one newspaper, and we started talking immediately with Black genealogy groups in Philadelphia, in the region. When we had a few hundred of them, we showed them the ads, and the more we spoke to more audiences, the more we realized that there were a lot of newspapers out there that carried these advertisements. Every time we spoke to a group of people, they said, "Did you check this newspaper? Did you check that newspaper?" Before we knew it, we had a much bigger project that we were in the middle of. The database now has 4,700 of these advertisements from about more than 200 different newspapers, Black newspapers that were published throughout the country in the post-war era. And they're still free, right? We're federally funded. We have been federally funded through the National Archives. We're not exactly sure if that federal funding will be renewed, but we get funded every year by the National Archives to find these advertisements and to publish them on the archive. And we've and the website is much more user-friendly than it was back in 2017 because we've consulted all along with genealogists and made this. The features on the website are made with genealogists in mind because they were our first and our first adopters, and they were our most important audience that we wanted to reach with the website. And it's from speaking with genealogists too that I decided that at some point in time there was one question that people always ask when we talk about the project, and that is whether or not people found each other, whether these ads were successful. And I never had a good answer for that question. And so what I decided I would do eventually was to try to find out, to follow about 10 of them, 10 searches to see if I could find out as much as I could about those people and about whether or not their back history and whether or not their searches were successful. And that's the origin of the book.
It's really interesting that you worked so closely with genealogists. You mentioned that in the book, and I knew that was the case because genealogists, and especially Black genealogists, have a different set of skills than historians do, and they're much more adept with certain kinds of records than historians. Myself, in the book I'm writing, I actually hired a woman genealogist, a brilliant woman called Lanice Hollister, because a lot of the information about the family I was trying to document was in property records. And this is genealogists' home territory, is, you know, tracing networks through deeds and so forth. So it's an amazing resource for historians, and vice versa now, mercifully, for genealogists. But I wanted to ask you, before we get into some of the stories, is at a certain point, I know you raised this, okay, maybe we should just talk about this right now. Judy, in the book, Judy calls this question of the success rate. She says that in her project, they started to call it the question. So it's the question you don't really want to answer, but you're going to have to answer. You give a number in the book. I don't know how you arrived at it, but I think you better tell people what the number is that you arrived at about the question. What was the success rate of people? My students ask me that every time I mention anything. So what's the success rate?
So we have about 47. I said we have 4,700 ads right now in the collection, and only 100 of them mention having found somebody. So the people who are good in the audience with math will tell you that's about what, Diego? So low percentage. It's a very low percentage.
In the book, like you said 2%.
Probably 2% is what we've estimated based on the collection. And there's problems with that, right? For one, that's based on people taking out a follow-up ad saying that they found somebody, which of course, right, is likely not representative of the experience of searching and finding, because if you could afford to take out an ad, you didn't necessarily, right, you weren't necessarily going to shell out money to take out another ad in which you said, I found somebody. So there's that problem with my 2% non-mathematical brain percentage that I came up with based on our numbers when we coded the ads. The other problem with that is that we do most of the 200 to 300 newspapers in the collection are Black newspapers. We do have a small subset of the newspapers in our collection that are white newspapers, and white newspapers loved telling reunion stories, and so of the 100, a few more than 100, advertisements that we have in our collection that mention a family that found one another again, percentage of those are actually published in white newspapers. So we give them a little extra treatment. We give them a little tag, and we say white newspaper is kind of a red flag, because clearly white newspapers had a different intention in mind. They were not serving the Black community, they were not run out of Black churches, and they had an incentive to tell a slavery story by the turn of the century that ended happily. And so the 2% number is derived from the archive, but we unless you follow these advertisements as far as you can through the records, it's hard to know how many people did find each other. It was likely low. The number was likely pretty low, though. The odds were considerable.
That's amazing and sobering. And I think I'd like to think of it as a confirmed 2%, meaning that there might be better news out there. And I also just want to point out that one of the things Judy does so beautifully in this book is all historians always caution their readers about the limits of the evidence that they have. That's just the way our brain works. And I think she gives a masterful account of how the national view of the Civil War and Reconstruction by the turn of the century, in a deeply, systematically racist period of American history, that how the lost cause narrative itself was shaping white people's interest in happy endings to slavery stories. Sort of, we didn't do any damage. It all worked out. Look at these happy people. So she does an amazing job with that. And I think part of the necessity is that so many of these ads came late. And I must say that as a reader of your book in manuscript, I was shocked at how many of them came late. So I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit more of what you learned from the database when you formed it about what are the most common, who's looking for who, what are the patterns here, who's the most common searcher, who are they looking for, how many of them are right after slavery ended, how many of them are much, much later. What are the most common kinds of searches and inquiries, and what are the least common? Because I think there's plenty of surprises in there.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll answer them in reverse order. So the most common searches, we did code the ads based on who was searching and who they were searching for. So the most common searches are, some of it's not surprising, other parts of it are surprising. Mothers are searching for their children, and children are searching for their mothers. Those are the most common, and equal to that, or about equal to that, are siblings looking for one another. And then fathers are also looking for their children, and children are looking for their fathers as well. And then we've got and we also have husbands and wives looking for one another. More husbands looking for wives than wives looking for husbands, which is something that I try to unpack in the book about why that would be the case. You probably are having some of your own thoughts about why that might be the case. And then there are a lot of and then there are other ones that don't fit into those buckets. There are sort of a number of veterans looking for one another. So U.S. colored troops veterans would look for one another, and then widows looked for comrades of their deceased husbands. In the U.S. colored troops, and those were all sort of we can kind of put those in the pension bucket. So there's a lot of people looking for help when they're trying to get pensions. So they're looking for likely also comradeship and other things like that, but they're also looking for help to navigate the pension bureau. And so those are the most common searches that are in the archive, and I tried to. And the book represents that. So the book, the stories that I chose in here were, I chose because they're representative of the archive. And then to your other question about sort of the patterns that you see in the advertisements. And so, the two most common searches I mentioned are mothers looking for their children, and then children looking for one another, siblings looking for one another. The second one, siblings looking for one another, makes sense if you sort of think about the long arc of the archive. So well into the 19th century and even the first few decades of the 20th century, sisters and brothers continued to look for one another. Even if they didn't know where their parents were, at some point in time in the early 20th century. We might read into these ads the sort of fading hope that they would find a parent alive, but they were still looking for they were still looking for siblings who they thought they might still find. And so early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century ads, a lot of those are siblings looking for one another. And then the earlier ads that start in the immediate aftermath of the war, we actually have ads that start even before the war ends. Sure, yeah. So some of them are people who've escaped, who are self-emancipating enslaved people who are, advertising at great risk to their own safety, I would add, from safe places in, Pennsylvania, New York, places who are going through gradual emancipation, or even New England or Canada West. So those are some of the earlier ads. But the earlier ads that we sort of post-war era, the mothers are rushing to take out these advertisements to look for their children. You can see a lot of those, and children looking for their mothers.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was the particular challenges fathers faced in trying to find their children, or vice versa. Which brings us to, I think, a really interesting subject I'm not sure historians have been very enlightening about, which is the issue of names and naming. Because if you're looking for somebody and their name is changing, or maybe you could talk a little bit about how the history of marriage under slavery made this even harder,
yeah.
and why it was that fathers had such a difficult time finding their children, much more so than mothers.
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, the institution of marriage, enslaved people didn't have access to legal marriage, right? In the institution of slavery, marriage was not recognized, right? There were marriages happening all the time, right? Either informal or among enslaved people, or sometimes officiated by enslavers, but states had no legal mechanism to recognize these marriages. Every state in which slavery was legal recognized the children of an enslaved woman as the property of her enslaver, not her own property. Right? Those children did not belong to her. They certainly didn't belong to her husband if she had a husband. Those are the sort of basic level difficulties of identifying or sort of making legal claims to these children based on laws that prohibited these, that didn't recognize these marriages. And on top of that, enslavers, though they claimed otherwise, often the families could be separated multiple times. So, an enslaved woman who comes free can have 5 or 6 children. Those children can come from could be with one man with whom she had a relationship, or she was married to, or they could come from 2 or 3 different, men with whom she had a relationship. So her claims were, so the ads are often full of many names, right? Her own name that might have changed every time she was sold, her children, who she had different, who could have different parents or whose names were also changed, which made her search difficult. And then doubly so with fathers who, whose claims to their children were even more attenuated than the mother's claims to their children. So when fathers, and there are a lot of fathers in the archive looking for their children, despite the fact that they, in some ways had even a steeper kind of hill to climb to find children from whom they might have been separated even earlier, even more quickly, and whose claims were in some ways even more legally attenuated.
Yeah, and one other thing you talk about that's fascinating is that, okay, spousal searches are the least common, and also, as you make clear, the most complicated. Not just the finding part, but the getting, if you are found part. And part of this has to do with what happened after the Civil War, which is what I meant in my opening remarks about how massive the undertaking was to undo what slavery had done. One of the things that the rights of slaveholders was written through every state and local law in the slave states, and it had to all be undone. Well, how do you do that? And at the beginning of Reconstruction, right after the Civil War, the legislatures were still just white men. And what they did was they went in and they rewrote the slave code. They rewrote the laws of their states in the kind of way that websites might now be purged. They just took out, they said, okay, the slave laws don't apply anymore. And then they wrote, and I don't think this is very well understood, they wrote these kind of umbrella laws that said, because what Judy just described is a pending disaster for the federal government. Now there are 4 million people. The government is used to having fathers and husbands as the point of contact for the government, and they're responsible for their families. If people can't claim their children, who claims the children? And so these states, finally facing the consequences of what they had done, wrote these umbrella laws that said, if you're with each other, you're married. Or if you were ever with each other, you're married, and your children are yours, and unlike white men, even if they're not legitimately your children, you're financially responsible for them. So they tried to offload the whole thing, so you didn't have a choice about whether you were going to be married or not. And so people were sort of unilaterally married, legally now, and then somebody searches for them, So what happens? Tell us about these stories. Why is this so complicated then? What is the human sort of drama of this?
Right. Yeah. And there were, and, and for people who had lived decades in which, the institution of marriage was, again, not legally recognized and also willfully always sort of ignored and violated. Now having these state laws that, that on one hand recognize marriages, but also, in some ways mandated marriages, was in itself, another kind of coercive measure. Right now, you could be, you could be found guilty of fornication, right, or polygamy, or something. If your marriage if your current marriage and your current family didn't fit under these new umbrella laws that were, like Stephanie said, were really intended to make sure that dependent children and elderly people were cared for, not by the state or by local officials, but by these now mandated families. So it was a really fraught situation for people, who might have several different spouses over a lifetime. So they didn't. It's not surprising that they're not rushing to the newspaper to look for spouses as much as they would in other relationships, because now marriages are sort of being defined by the state, which is also putting in place black codes. And now looking for ways to now enforce a new kind of marriage regime on people one step removed from slavery, and whose family relationships don't look like what's being mandated now by these white legislatures. So it's with that kind of knowledge in mind that we can see why it would be difficult for people to go to the newspapers to advertise. And I do talk about one person in the book who actually advertises for two of his wives at the same time in one advertisement. He talks about the children he had with both of them, and there are some of those ads in the collection, and it represents that kind of violence that was done to black families in slavery, and also this sort of some of those advertisements say I'm remarried, I want to find my other wife, because I want to support those children. I feel an obligation to the children that I had with her 20, 30 years ago. It's an intensely complicated thing. The marriage stuff in particular is really complicated, and that's why in that chapter, all the other chapters are really just about one family. That chapter is about three different marriages, to sort of get a sense of the particular difficulties of reconstructing marriages.
The work she did to put these stories back together is really stunning, because as you can see from the ads that she was showing at the beginning, some of these ads are 5 lines long, and she's creating a family history that goes backwards and forwards. I didn't really expect that when I opened the book, and so I really have to congratulate you on that. It's a massive amount of work. Men were, one of the things I think we haven't mentioned yet, but is very obvious in the book, is that there's a spatial dimension to this. If you look at a map of where people were born and were sold from and where they ended up as adults, the most common pattern is that they were from Virginia or Maryland or North Carolina, and they ended up in Louisiana or Alabama or Mississippi, and their children might be back there, their original wife might be back there. Mm-hmm. And so these searches are going over very long, physically over very long stretches. And what people would say when they explained how they got to Louisiana, later in the Depression, when they were interviewed and stuff, they would say, we were stolen, fetched here. And Judy, I think, in certain of the stories she tells in the book, or even in the ads, she points out, people writing the ads will not concede the ownership principle of slavery, right? Tell us about what they do, and then I'll ask you to do the reading.
Oh, sure, it's actually in that reading.
Oh, perfect. I just love that part.
Good. Yeah, that was good. So the advertisements, and we see this particularly for among parents when they are advertising for their children, they're editorializing, right? So the ads that you saw maybe not all of these, but a lot of the ads, they'll name their enslaver, they name their families, and they name their enslavers, and they say, this enslaver sold me to this enslaver, this trader. They keep track of all the names. And that's important, right, for them that and it's also just really impressive that they held all that information in their head for all those decades and then put it all on paper when they had a chance to go to the paper. But they also, you can see the raw emotions in the way that they're not, they're not conceding to this notion that anybody ever actually could own anybody else. They're not sort of adopting the chattel principle as a possibility. Clara Bashop, who I'll talk about in just a minute, for instance, she conducts her search from New York. She's from Virginia originally. She gets sold away from her children. She winds up in Mississippi, and then she retraces when she becomes free, she spends the next couple of decades just retracing her steps through the domestic slave trade that Stephanie just described, and each place she advertises for her children. And in her advertisements, she names her children, and she says in parentheses, they belong to T.H. Green, in name only, in parentheses. And there's a lot of that. When we first saw those, we thought, okay, maybe there's just a few people who inserted that principle in their ads, but there are more than a few. And I think that speaks volumes for the way that parents saw this institution as built on a lie, right? That somebody could own anybody else, and somebody else's children could belong to anybody but their own family, their own mother or their own father. There's and at first we thought maybe it was a sort of editor working in a black newspaper, maybe it was just one newspaper, but it happens in a lot of different places. And so I think it's a really telling, way to measure that sort of resilience, right? That refusal to accept the language of ownership that informed slavery. Let's hear some. All right. So this is Clara Bashop. I'll read just a section of it. This is the beginning of the book. Each chapter begins with an advertisement, as Stephanie said, and then I try my best to tell the story behind the advertisement. So this is chapter 1. This is Patience and Clara Bashop. So as I said, she's originally from Virginia, winds up in Mississippi, and then comes here to New York, where she does some of her searching. Clara Bashop had looked for her children in many places in the years she had been free. In October 1892, she traveled from her home in Morristown, New Jersey, to take her search to the world, that is, the New York world. Surely a newspaper with a name like that in a place like New York City could help. Bashop arrived at the offices of the New York World on October 1st. Someone noticed her, tall and dignified, walking into the bustling newspaper office on a Saturday and steered her to a reporter's desk, instead of to a clerk to whom she might have paid for a short ad describing people and places in the Old South, each one a clue that might lead her to her daughter, Patience. The reporter was struck by the figure she cut. When Bashop began to talk, the tears flowed down her face and dropped on the folds of her thick black veil. It's a quote. Here was a story, they thought, that would sell papers. Quote, a 30-year search, Mrs. Bashop's pitiful quest for her daughter Patience, read the headline. Tears have often flowed over the woes of Uncle Tom, but Clara's story is sadder and more pathetic than the one Mrs. Stowe so feelingly told. Sadder than Eliza's flight across the Ohio River with her child in her hands, because unlike the fictional character in Uncle Tom's Cabin, Clara Bashop had not managed to save her child. More pathetic because she was a real person sitting across from the reporter, crying as he wrote down the story she told. A real person who needed the world's help. Knowing the power of a great newspaper, she came to New York and asked the world to help, read the paper. Bashop's story was published the next day in The World and the St. Louis Dispatch, and then 2 days later in the San Francisco Chronicle. 3 major newspapers spanning the country. This unprecedented coverage gave Clara Bashop an enormous audience for her story of slavery and survival, and it surely raised her hopes for a long-awaited reunion with her daughter. Such a reunion would make good newspaper copy. The reporter for The World sprinkled the story with direct quotes from Bashop, like, "She was a bright little girl," which was sure to touch readers' hearts as they waited for the sequel to build in anticipation. As was the line, "I would know her the moment I saw her. I will find her yet." The reporter described Clara as, quote, "tall and slender, and with a face that shows the refinement which the colored women in the aristocratic old families of the South so often possessed." If the reference to Bashop's aristocratic features was meant to imply her mixed race, then the reporter may silently have been acknowledging the routine rape of enslaved women again without laying any blame. As had Stowe in populating Uncle Tom's Cabin with light-skinned enslaved people like Eliza, who was described in the book's opening pages as having, quote, "a finely molded shape, a delicately formed hand, and a trim foot and ankle." The World reporter's reference to Clara Bashop's refined features, what writer Caroline Randall Williams has called rape-colored skin, tapped into white readers' obsession with mixed-race women. If Bash's appearance wasn't enough to elicit white readers' sympathies, the author repeated the endorsement of her current employers in Morristown, New Jersey, a bedroom community for wealthy New Yorkers where Bashop lived and worked at a boarding house and where she was in charge of one of the most important departments. And then there was her motherhood. Clara Bashop's 33-year search for patience surely was evidence of the universality of mother love. For patience surely was, the World concluded, that a mother's heart beats just as strong in the humble bosom of a slave as in the hearts of the paper's white readers. Although Clara Bashop was a free woman and had been for more than 30 years, the references to her praying, begging, and weeping collapsed the distance in time and place between late 19th century New York City and mid-century Virginia, locating Bashop in the same space as the unfortunate Dick Christian, her former enslaver, who became involved in debt and whose slaves were placed on the block. Dick Christian was not the villain in this story. In spite of her dignified presentation, though, Clara Bashop was also not a victim. She was scarred and traumatized by losing her patience. In the World's telling of Clara Bashop's separation from her daughter, slavery had been scrubbed of meaning. It no longer held the power to explain what happened to Clara, Patience, and millions of other former slaves. It was rather that these things, a man's debt, the auctioning off of human beings, the separation of a mother and a child, happened to people, but not because of them. But of course, separating families was a central fact of slavery. Mothers and daughters, brothers and sisters, wives and husbands were routinely sold away from one another. It was what made possible the settling of the cotton frontier of the Mississippi Valley, from which people like Dick Christian would become rich or lose it all or both, investing in slavery and slave-produced cotton. Prime field hands, that's what people in their late teens and early 20s, like Bashop, were called because they could pick a lot of cotton in a place like Mississippi and because selling them brought a good price to a Virginia family like the Christians. Of course, people at that age were also very likely to have children, to have claimed for themselves a family with an institution that denied them that privilege. With family came a sense of belonging, and in slavery, one belonged only to the master. So while enslavers might condone or tolerate slave families, they saw the ties between family members as loose and easily cut. Slaveholders did not always recognize the market value of children who were too young to work the fields, so often children were not sold with their mothers, fathers, or older siblings. They were sold separately, like patients. The reporters at the World were not interested in any of those facts about slavery. Middle-aged Patience was a lost girl, as the story called her, repeatedly, as if she had simply wandered off. And her mother deserved pity for having kept up her search for so long. By the time Clara Bashop's account of slavery and survival had been co-opted by the New York World, looking for a human interest story about an old slave woman's faithful search for her daughter, white papers everywhere were publishing similar stories that threw a thick blanket of nostalgia over the history of slavery. The forgetting, the cover-up, began in the stories white newspapers and magazines told about the past, reinforced in public places by statues, plaques, and monuments to enslavers appeared. Many years later, to those was added a flag associated with this time, but really a product of a later one, that flew high over Southern Capitol buildings. Schools and U.S. military bases were named for men who had raised arms against their country in defense of slavery. By the 20th century, many layers of forgetting lay on top of experiences like Bashop's. But at first, there were words that seemed to be telling the same stories with crucial differences. Clara Bashop chose her words carefully in the ad she placed in the Chicago Appeal. She named both of her children the man who separated her from them and the last known places for both Patience and John. I wish to find my daughter, Patience Green. I have no trace of her since she was sold at Richmond, Virginia in 1859. She was then 12 years of age. John William Harris, my son, went with some servants of Mr. Batts after the surrender, who lived in Prince George County, to Washington City. He was 14 years old at the time. She said nothing in her ad about Christian's debt, if that was what had made him decide to sell Clara and Patience, nor of her seeking help from her enslavers in finding her children. Nothing about the 33-year search that so captivated the author of the World account. Bashop did not use adjectives to elicit sympathy or pity. She asked Appeal readers to contact her directly if they had any information that could be useful to her search. And she added a 3-word caveat, a postscript to the clause identifying the man who had sent her away from her children, who had exercised his legal right as an owner of people to sell them at his convenience. The children, she said, belonged to Dick Christian in name only. Clara Bashop's 2 children did not share her last name. Perhaps they never had. Of their whereabouts, she knew little, and much of the rest of the family's story is unclear. But about one thing, Bashop was very clear. John and Patience belonged to her. They always had.
Well, I think that's an example of I don't even know how many stories, not just the number of chapters, which are about focus on a certain person, but the just diversity and richness of the stories that are in here. Very moving, moving things like about how George Williams learned to read and write at night school in New Jersey when he was 50 years old, and about the small, tight black community he and his wife were part of in Montclair, New Jersey. And George Williams then used his literary skills to go out and look for his brother at age 70. And he'd been separated from his brother since the brother was age 5. So the kind of dedication and commitment, even if it's only emotional, not only emotional, even if they must have known what long shots these were, and yet here they were persisting again and again and again. And one of the things that I think comes out so clearly from the diversity of cases that you research and stories you tell is that there isn't even really an obvious definition of family.
Yeah.
So yes, wives looked for their husbands. Well, mothers looked for their children, so forth and so on. But that wasn't all. So you tell the story, for example, of Dinah and Henry Saffold, who he spent half his life trying to get a pension from the federal government for his service in the Army, because Judy calls that chapter chain of evidence. He can't produce the proof. But to me, the most interesting part of the story is the way he and his wife, as you said, made and remade their family. So could you tell us about that case, if you remember, but also what it tells us about, we shouldn't be too quick to assume we know what family means when people say they're going out to look for their children or their family. Right. So tell us how broad this is, or what we do need to know about the way Black people who had been enslaved thought about family.
Right, yeah, and it's in that chapter and some of the other chapters too. Because one of the ways before I could commit to writing a chapter, I had to find enough evidence. I had to find the people in the records with enough sort of confidence that I could tell their story with integrity. And so so I find them in pension records, or I find them in the census, I find them in other federal or local records, and you're sort of searching searching for the proof that they found each other, right? Which you can, which hopefully you find that census record and you say, aha, right, there they are, living together in the same house, right? My students, when I make them do this exercise, they always are convinced everybody always gets together. They always find the evidence that they reunited. But these records also show you how formerly enslaved people are forming families from people who they became free with. They're defining family by kinship ties. They're defining family by bonds of affection. They're taking in their children's children if their children are somehow no longer able to, and there are all sorts of ways in which these the families that we're finding, and anybody who's spent any time in pension records will tell you that these are very flexible and responsive definitions of family that are intended to address the needs of people who are one step removed from slavery, and oftentimes far from anybody who that they can trace direct family, sort of genetic family ties to. Yet these families are very able and willing to sort of be creative out of the remnants of others. And so there's a lot of moving around. There's a lot of, in Saffolt's case, there are, children appear in his, in the census records in his pension that I don't have records of 10 years before, but who are defined as his children. So clearly what they're doing is responding to the needs of the moment. And these children are coming into their families when they need, when those children need parents, and Saffold is willing to spend whatever he's getting from the Pension Bureau, which is not a lot, to support his own, to support the children that he had with his own wife, and then other people's children as well.
Yeah, it's incredibly moving. So we're going to move to questions in 1 second. I just wanted to ask you last, Judy, what's the story that moved you the most? I mean, I can't quite imagine writing this. It's not even easy to read it. And I don't necessarily mean it that way. I'm just saying, for you, what's the story that stuck with you or that you found hardest to write?
So the chapter on Henry Tibbs was really hard. This is a man who was separated from his mother when he was very young. And then he lives his whole life. He's enlists in the U.S. colored troops. He survives the Fort Pillow massacre and other traumatic events in his adult life. And then when he's in his late 50s, he goes to the newspaper to try to find his mother. And he remembers her heroic efforts to try to help him when he's separated from her and held in a slave jail. And it's, she brings him, he's crying, she brings him cake and candy and tries to make him feel comfortable. And he remembers almost nothing about her. other than her name Hannah, and so there was really hardly anything for me to try to find her. I tried everything I could to try to find her, but I found him a lot in the records because he's looking for her, and he's also because he's a soldier, right? He's got pension records, but that chapter really brought home to me what it means for young people who are taken from their families and suffer a traumatic event like that. And because of that, I started reading all of the literature on, children and child development when children suffer trauma. So, as I was sort of telling Henry's story, it really brought home to me what it would mean over his lifetime, right, to have lost his mother. So the milestones he would miss, right, that we potentially miss, right? We know that children who suffer trauma can miss milestones, right? They can have trouble with creating new memories, right? There's all sorts of ways in which that trauma can live with you for a lifetime. And that was really hard. As I was writing that, children were being separated from their parents at the border, and at the time I was writing it, and so for me that was really hard. And as a person who is I have parents and I am a parent, that part was really hard, and it was hard to write it, and it was hard to think about it. And certainly for Henry, it was a hard thing for him to live through. But he also formed a family of his own, right? He had children. He survived it, and then he told his mother's story in these series, in this advertisement that he took out looking for her. So.
And his only real memory of her is the feeling of comfort.
Yeah.
So now we'll go to the audience. It's all up to you guys now. So we have microphones here at the front. So if you'd like to ask a question, just move towards ask for the microphone.
Do we roughly, were the ads expensive to place? And were the ads expensive to place? And, do you think that had any correlation with how many were placed or you found?
Oh, that's a good question. Some Black newspapers, so most of the Black newspaper, or a lot of the Black newspapers were edited by Black pastors, who we haven't spoken of a lot today, but they're all over the book because they're important allies in this search. A lot of the advertisements, maybe not the ones that we saw here today, the advertisers list a pastor who's helping them either write it or pay, maybe pay for it, or just sort of there at the church as kind of a clearinghouse of information. So some of these, and they were also editors of the newspaper. So sometimes they solicited these advertisements and said, we'll place any advertisement for free. Others you had to pay for a subscription to the newspaper, and then you got to advertise for free. So the Christian Recorder, which is the Philadelphia newspaper, you had to pay like $1.50 for a subscription to the newspaper, and then you could place a number of ads in the newspaper. The Southwest Christian Advocate, which was published out of New Orleans, I don't think you had to. I think you just had to pay. There wasn't that same sort of arrangement. And so it wasn't. So to answer your question, it was not an inconsiderable amount of money to spend. To spend $1.50 to place an advertisement. Plus, on top of that, you then have to, if you're writing in, you had to pay postage to mail. If you're not living in Philadelphia or New Orleans and you're writing into one of those newspapers, you have to pay for that. So that was money. And then when you did find somebody, the paying to go to them was also an expense. So, and to your other answer, do we know if we found them all, or if there's some that we have? Is that what you asked? The second question that you asked about the advertisements? Oh, okay. I don't know if we've found all of the advertisements. We're still looking. As long as we're federally funded, we'll keep looking in the newspapers. We keep finding more in newspapers that we never expected to find them in the Chicago Defender, right, which didn't even start publishing into the 20th century, but we found them there. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for that presentation. It's very informative. I'd like to know, in general, what was the last notice you found, the date? How late did they tend to run?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. There's
How late did what was the last notice that you saw? Like what decade, what year?
Oh, we have some from the 1920s that we can, there's a couple to answer that question. We have some advertisements, people still looking for their family members who they say they were separated from in slavery, published in the 1920s. We do have some advertisements after that that we're not as sure that they're not giving us the sort of red flag they're not saying that they were separated in slavery, but we've included them because they were close enough in time, and we have enough from that community of people who were looking. So 1920s, early 1920s. Yep.
Hello, I'm a member of AUGS, or the genealogical chapter in New York here. The question I have, would you be able to find, because I think that in the 42nd Street Library on Fifth Avenue, they have good records in newspapers, if I'm correct, because I did find some, newspapers old, way back, but I don't know how far they go back. But I know that 42nd Street Library on Fifth Avenue, would your ads be in the library on 42nd Street?
Yeah.
It would be?
Sorry?
Yeah, no, excuse me, go ahead.
So we, for some reason there's an echo, and I'm sorry if I jumped in too quickly. So we do have, so those are New York newspapers, do we think?
Yes,
Yeah.
I saw it, I had a readout of it, but, because people in our chapter have found, they had newspaper clippings of runaway slaves, and one lady, she found her ancestor.
Right. Yes. So tell me if I've answered your question. So we will find, and we will. So thank you for that tip. I will follow it up. We have a pretty comprehensive list of what we think it's pretty comprehensive of all the Black newspapers that were published in the 19th century, wherever they were published. And we're systematically going through them all to see what we can borrow. And they have to be microfilmed because somebody's not going to send us something that's not microfilmed. And sometimes even when they're microfilmed, they're not sending it to us. So we're having to go places to find them. And so we do have a number of New York newspapers in our collection, a number of them. And so maybe those are some of them, but I can check our database to see if we've identified a library in New York that might have them, because that's certainly closer for me to go than someplace else. I'm sure we have not collected obituaries, but they're also. Right, they're, from genealogists, I've learned they're great. Those are amazing sources to do histories like this too. Yeah, absolutely. Our collection is only the ads that are looking for people. Yeah, and you also mentioned the runaway, the slave runaway ads. Right, which are there's a digital project called Freedom on the Move is run out of Cornell University. And they have tens of thousands of those advertisements, right? And it's fascinating because those are sort of the flip side of, right, Clara Bashop's writing saying, they're my children, right? She's trying to find her children. It's kind of the inverse. Our database, you can search by, they had the QR code up there. I also have business cards that you can get it. You can get our database. You can search by anything. You can search by last name. You can by surname. You can search by first name. You can search by region. We have a dynamic map. So if you don't really even know what people's names are or what they might have been. You can zoom in. If you know the county in South Carolina where somebody might be that you're looking for, you can zoom in and just search the ads that mention that place. That's again, those are things that we put in place because genealogists have told us the limitations of searching for people whose names will change or will be spelled different ways. So our database allows you to do those kinds of searches however you want to do them. Or even if you just want to look at one newspaper, to see all the different advertisements that were placed in this one newspaper. I could go on and on about all the cool features that we have. You probably don't really want to know all of them. But anyway, it should sustain any of those kind of searches. Yeah.
Question.
Sorry. We have time for just one more question, Richard.
Okay. In a recent presentation by Dominique, who's the center historian, she mentioned that many formerly enslaved folks adopted their last name of the enslaver so that they would be able to establish a link to their past. Mm-hmm. Did you encounter that when you were doing your research?
Yes. Yes, a lot. We see that a lot in the advertisements. There's a woman whose story I tell in chapter 2, whose name is Hagar Outlaw, who had, a number of children, and her enslaver was David Outlaw, she was in North Carolina, and he's a congressman in North Carolina, and she kept the outlaw name. And all of her children kept, they seem to have kept the outlaw name, and it certainly made her, in some cases, we can imagine it made her search easier because, she was she stayed in North Carolina. She continued to have this name of this prominent man who other people knew, and who might be able to sort of help her. He certainly was not an ally in her search. But people knew the outlaw name, and so it makes sort of sense that might have been a strategic decision on her part to keep that name, and all of her children had that name, and likely made it easier for her, or it helped her find her children. She finds 3 of her children, so yeah. But there are also a lot of, there are a lot of advertisements that give 3 different last names for one person. So people are changing their name for a variety of reasons. But retaining the name of an enslaver might help you in a search. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that's what we have time for. I'll turn it back to you, Marcia.
Yes, I thank you so much. It was, thank you all. And wonderful conversation. Judy will sign books in the front. We have them in the shop. I hope you all come back to more programs that relate to traces and other things, and have a great night. Thank you.